There's a long history, a very complex but also violent history in relationship to the state. We saw consecutive regimes, not only the Bashir regime, but also the Nimeri regime, really violently repress resistance and displace people off of their land and their livelihoods in order to enable the continued resource extraction and enrichment of elites in government.
Sudan is the site of one of the world's great humanitarian disasters. Since war broke out in April 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, catastrophe has overwhelmed it. Tens of thousands of people have died. Out of Sudan's population of 48 million, over 13 million have been displaced, making Sudan the largest internal displacement crisis on Earth. Some 30 million Sudanese are in dire need of food aid in a country that could easily feed itself and the entire region. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Sudan is one of the wonders of the world. The country is teeming with natural and cultural resources. Located in northeast Africa, bordering the Red Sea and 7 other countries, including Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Chad, it is the 3rd largest nation on the continent, a country with over 50 ethnic groups, a land in which over 80 languages are spoken, a vast territory with rich, enduring traditions of music, literature, the visual arts, and architecture. Sudan is renowned for its Kushite pyramids and temples and Nubian designs. It was the birthplace of the celebrated writer Tayyib Saleh, author of one of the great novels of the 20th century, and musician Mohammed Wardi. Also home to the pioneering visual artist Kamala Ishak and the influential Khartoum School of Art. Sudan's many assets include oil, gas, gold, copper, and iron ore. It has one of the largest expanses of arable land in Africa, allowing it to produce wheat, cotton, millet, and gum arabic, the natural resin used in soft drinks, cosmetics, and pharmaceuticals. Sudan also has livestock and bountiful water resources. And yet, despite Sudan's abundance of riches, since the country won its independence in January 1956, the majority of Sudanese people have not benefited from the country's wealth. Indeed, over the last 70 years, Sudan has been plagued by conflict and wars that have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and prevented the country from realizing its tremendous potential. Nisrin Elamin is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and the African Studies program at the University of Toronto. Her work investigates the connections between land, race, belonging, and empire-making in Sudan and the broader Sahel region. She is currently working on a book project based on 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork in central Sudan. Professor Nisrin Elamin, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nisrin, we know that the humanitarian situation in Sudan is dire, and I know that you are in regular touch with people on the ground in the country. Can you give us a sense of what your contacts are telling you about the situation right now?
As you mentioned, Sudan is currently home to the largest humanitarian and displacement crisis in the world. Over 12 million people have been displaced by this war, many multiple times, including many members of my family. So while the region they're currently in, which is called the Jazeera, it's just south of Khartoum, is relatively stable now that the RSF has retreated, the infrastructure, the sort of, hospitals have been destroyed. There's no water, there's no electricity. There are cholera and dengue fever epidemics. Malaria is on the rise. And of course, people haven't been able to make a living since April of 2023. So things are really difficult, I think, especially for the most vulnerable, right? For children, for elderly people. So if you have diabetes or need dialysis, for example, it's extremely difficult to get proper care, which then predisposes you to infectious diseases. So the situation is really dire in places like Darfur, where there is still very much active conflict. People in Al-Fashir, in the capital of North Darfur, have been under siege since May of 2024 and are essentially trapped as the RSF is blocking the entry of food supplies and aid. It's very difficult to get access to food, and the food that is available, the prices are just skyrocketing. It's hard to, get people proper attention in terms of medical care because a lot of the international aid agencies have evacuated due to security. I mean, what we're seeing really is Sudanese people suffering, but also mobilizing to support each other as they survive this war.
I want to talk about the long and deep history of Sudan, but I wanted to kind of go back to April of 2023, because on April 15th, 2023, when the war broke out, you were in Sudan at that time. Can you just describe to us what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, I was in Khartoum on April 15th of 2023. I had arrived about a week earlier with my 3-year-old daughter. I was mostly there to visit family that I hadn't seen in a couple of years since the revolution started. I hadn't been back. So I was in Khartoum. It was Ramadan. We were awoken essentially on April 15th to explosions and gunfire. And it was quite abrupt, the sort of outbreak of war. It was quite intense, and it was very, electricity cut immediately, water cut immediately. The neighborhood stores ran out of food quite quickly because, of course, all the supply chains were interrupted. Petrol stations shut down, so it was also hard to leave the city. And there were these curfews that would happen during the time when people break their fast. And it was during those times that I would go out in search of food because we were living in this rented apartment. We didn't have much food at home. And so I was essentially going out, looking for food for my daughter, and quickly realized there was no bread, there was no fresh milk, there were no eggs, so it was quite challenging. And we also realized soon, a few days in, that we really needed to leave because the entire neighborhood essentially evacuated given how intense the conflict was. The house next to us got hit, for example. You could just, I mean, we were really in the middle of it.
You were dodging bullets as you tried to get food for your child.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And people were helping, though. I mean, that was the other thing that was really amazing. I found that young people who were part of the resistance committees were immediately mobilizing to help people, especially elderly people who couldn't go out and dodge bullets to get food, get access to food. So there would be people who would go line up to get bread and then distribute those bags of bread across the neighborhood. People who had chickens, for example, were distributing eggs to neighbors. So that kind of sense of solidarity just was very powerful.
This conflict is complicated. So it's really important that we kind of spell out who the players are. And we're going to do that. But the war that broke out in April 2023 was a real blow to people because just 5 years earlier, in 2018, ordinary Sudanese people were beginning to have hope that fundamental transformative change was possible in the country. We know that millions of Sudanese people took part in a nationwide mass movement determined to end the authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, a dictator who had ruled over the country, as you mentioned, for some 30 years. So help us to understand what has happened or what happened in Sudan between 2018 and 2023. Can you kind of take us back to those hopeful times of 2018 and then also just kind of explain who the players are?
So, as you mentioned, the revolution that kind of erupted in December of 2018 was particularly significant because it started in Sudan's kind of rural and sort of peripheral areas before it arrived in Khartoum in February of 2019 and sort of centralized in a massive sit-in in front of the military headquarters in the capital, and then, of course, ousted al-Bashir in April of 2019. And it was very powerful because we'd had several revolutions before, one in 1964, one in 1985, that had overthrown military dictatorships, but none this broad, if you will, and none that had brought together rural demands for land reform with long-standing grievances from areas that had been impacted by state violence really since independence, with sort of more urban demands for economic justice. The resistance committees that we talked about earlier, they predate the revolution. A lot of them, you sort of think about their roots as having emerged from protests that happened in 2011, in 2013, and in 2016, primarily against IMF-recommended austerity measures.
The International Monetary Fund.
Yes, exactly. And that's actually one of the ways that the revolution started, is that it was a response to austerity measures that al-Bashir's regime had implemented. So you had this mobilization happening, in June of 2019. It was a microcosm of what people hoped Sudan could be beyond military rule, beyond elite rule. Sudan has, for most of its history, been under military rule. And people, certainly the young people who were, mobilizing with these resistance committees, had never experienced anything beyond the Bashir regime. And so it was a really powerful mobilization. And in June of 2019, the state, and it was actually led by the RSF, committed a massacre in the sit-in, killing several hundred people, breaking it up. And then, a couple of months after, they formed a transitional government that was a power sharing agreement between military elites from within al Bashir's inner circle. Al Burhan, head of the army, and Hemeti, head of the rapid support forces, were kind of part of the military wing of that power sharing agreement. And then there were a group of sort of hand-picked technocrats and civilian elites, I would say, who were part of the mobilization against the Bashir regime, who formed the civilian part of that transitional government. But it was during that time, really, that the resistance committees and the more grassroots elements of the revolution were sidelined when that transitional government was formed. And I think that was the beginnings, really, of the counter-revolution, because the civilian elites turned outwards, implementing more neoliberal reforms and, for example, normalizing relations with Israel in exchange for annual funding from the World Bank, 1 billion in annual funding, and other kinds of policies that really deepened Sudan's economic crisis and made life harder rather than better for people.
Help us to understand why the popular revolution, in addition to obviously these austerity measures that were being implemented by the Bashir regime, what were they revolting against? What did the al-Bashir regime represent? Who was he?
Part of what was perhaps powerful but also challenging in unifying people around a central set of demands is that people had a different relationship to the state. If you were from Darfur, for example, and from a non-Arab community, you would have experienced the genocide in Darfur that started in 2003, that at the time was led by the Janjaweed, who were later turned into the rapid support forces. And they were essentially a paramilitary group that was armed, and they're mostly pastoralists who identify as Arabs, against sedentary non-Arab communities who were competing with each other for grazing land as the kind of climate crisis was expanding. Of course, people who had been displaced or had lost relatives due to the genocide in 2003 had a particular relationship to the Bashir regime, whereas somebody in Khartoum, maybe who's from a more middle-class background, who isn't as impacted by state violence, might have a sort of a grievance that is more around the austerity measures and the kind of economic crisis and how difficult it is to make ends meet. And then if you go to the Jazeera, the rural parts of Sudan, where, the vast majority of Sudanese, 60 to 70%, still rely on agriculture partially to make a living. And the Bashir regime implemented privatization policies that really decimated the agricultural sector and made it a lot harder for small farmers and pastoralists to survive. And in fact, the rapid support forces draw mostly, in terms of their recruitment, from pastoralists who've been impacted by those privatization policies and by the influx of both domestic and foreign investments in agriculture and kind of large-scale agribusiness projects that cut off grazing routes and dispossess people of their land. And so I think there are various reasons that people protested against al-Bashir. But one of the things I wanted to briefly mention is that the Janjaweed, which turned into the RSF around 2013, they were sort of formalized by the Bashir regime as a coup-proofing strategy against the military.
So the Janjaweed that became the RSF, this was a creation of Omar al-Bashir, who was trying to put down rebel forces in the Darfur region who felt as if they had been marginalized, who felt as if they had never been given their due by the state. Is that a kind of a way of kind of understanding the reason for the rebellions in Darfur?
Yes, yes. And I think the rebellions in Darfur, at their roots, go back to the 1950s when the Sudanese state was forming. The British left 800 seats kind of were handed over to Sudanese elites, essentially. But those elites were from the north and center of the country.
Who are Arab? Is that a way of understanding it?
Yes, I mean, they identify as Arab, but also Nubian, but they're central and northern Sudanese. I mean, there's definitely a racialized element, but I would say that it was the state itself that became a kind of ethno-nationalist, racialized state in the sense that an Amir Idris, a historian from Darfur, describes this very well in his work, where he talks about the ways that we saw from the very formation of the Sudanese government, a kind of forced Arabization and Islamization project imposed on an incredibly diverse country. And as a result, you saw through the formation of this government or state structure, an elite state form to the exclusion and at the expense of peripheral regions like South Sudan, which at the time were, there were 2 million people, the size of Texas, and Darfur, which is also the size of Texas and home to millions.
And these regions, Nisrin, these regions are resource rich. These regions have oil. These regions have plentiful arable land. So these are regions were very valuable to the state.
Yes, exactly. And so by essentially making sure that those regions don't have adequate representation in governments, right? That means that allocation for infrastructure development, et cetera, becomes centralized in certain regions at the expense of others. And people, of course, resisted against that. And instead of the government listening and elites listening to that, those complaints for decades fell on deaf ears. So what we saw happening in 2003 when Darfurian resistance fighters started to take up arms was decades of having been neglected and marginalized and
impoverished, immiserated.
yes. I mean, there was a famine in the 1980s, for example. At the time, President Numeri not only ignored the famine, refused to bring food aid in to Darfur, and hundreds and thousands of people died, right? So there's a long history, a very complex but also violent history in relationship to the state in places like Darfur and South Sudan as well. The South Sudanese resistance fighters took up arms in 1955, right before we gained independence, for very similar reasons to why Darfurians took up arms in 2003. The roots are the same. It's the Sudanese state being sort of captured by elites, exploiting resources from these vast, I don't even like to call them peripheries because they're very large areas. But as you said, 75% of Sudan's oil resources are now in independent South Sudan, right? Darfur is not only rich in sort of agricultural land, but also in all kinds of minerals like gold, like uranium that are currently fueling this war. And so we saw consecutive regimes, not only the Bashir regime, but also the Numeri regime, really violently repress resistance and displace people off of their land and their livelihoods in order to enable the continued resource extraction and enrichment of elites in government, which also gradually took over more and more of the economy to the point where when the revolution started, the military owned over 200 companies in rubber, oil, infrastructure, real estate, and essentially about 70% of the economy was run by military elites, right? Which is partly why Sudanese people have for decades not really been able to benefit from the kind of resources and the richness that exists in Sudan because it's been essentially stolen by the elites.
So the two forces that are at war right now, the Rapid Support Forces and also the Sudanese Armed Forces, they're both businesses. Like Burhan, who heads the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Hemeti, who heads the RSF, they're both major players in Sudan's economy.
Yes, absolutely. There's some overlapping economic interests and some separate, but the RSF, after it was formalized, right, in 2013, the European Union, through something called the Khartoum process in 2014, essentially turned them into their border patrol by externalizing their border regime to the border between Libya and Sudan. And so there was an infusion of about $200 million that then allowed the RSF to expand and formalize them, legitimize them as border control. They then were also used as kind of mercenaries in the war against Yemen, right, by the Saudi coalition.
And the UAE as well.
Yes, exactly, by the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So there's been a long-standing relationship between the UAE and the RSF, which is partly why that partnership where the UAE is now extracting Sudanese gold in exchange for weapons to the RSF is not necessarily like a very new thing. It's kind of dates back to that kind of them using the RSF as mercenaries for hire.
I want to talk a little bit about the foreign actors who are involved in this conflict and to kind of maybe help people understand why so many foreign interests are interested in Sudan. Can we establish just the geopolitical significance of Sudan? Because we know that Sudan borders the Red Sea, which sits between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and connects Europe to the Indian Ocean via the Suez Canal. We know that, 15% of world trade, including oil and natural gas exports, along with 30% of global container shipping, passes through that canal. Talk a little bit about the geopolitics, the geographical significance of Sudan, and why so many foreign actors are interested in what's happening there.
That's an excellent question. And, this is not the first time that Sudan has been seen as the answer, perhaps, to external kind of economic crises. So we've had, of course, Ottoman Empire, and then the British Empire has for centuries been extracting Sudanese resources. I think what we're seeing today is in some ways a continuation of that, right? It layers itself on top of those colonial forms of extraction. And now we're mostly seeing the Gulf as the kind of harmful external actors, specifically the UAE, as we've mentioned. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, before this war began, over the last 20 years, have invested $27 billion combined in Sudanese land, agriculture, ports. But to me, it's about more than that. It's about regional power. It's about controlling the Red Sea, right, as a strategic point, as you said, for a variety of reasons, military, political, economic. The Emirates, right before the war, signed a deal, a $6 billion port deal with Sudanese military and business elites in order to develop a private airport and a private toll road that would connect that port project to Emirati agribusiness projects inland and allow them to kind of export things quite quickly. Part of the significance of that port project was that it would undermine the national port, where there's a very vibrant history of port worker organizing against the privatization and selling off of that port. And so they learned from that experience and said, okay, we're going to just put it 200 kilometers north where there probably won't be much resistance. And we're seeing the Emirates expand its power through ports across the Horn of Africa. And to me, it's about not only controlling what comes in and out of the region, but also undermining domestic production, right? And being able to kind of extract our resources. And so what does that do? That means that people in rural areas are losing their livelihoods, and then they get pushed into the security state. The army and the RSF are now Sudan's biggest job recruiters, right, if you will. And so we're seeing the kind of inflated security state, and that is going to continue to destabilize Sudan for the long run, right?
We know that actors like Russia and China and the United States all have interests too.
Yes, and I think that's very important to emphasize. I feel like sometimes we, including myself, I tend to overemphasize the role of the UAE, even though it is probably the biggest and most harmful actor. But on the army side, you have countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, even the Ukraine supporting the army, because on the RSF side, the UAE and Russia's Africa Corps have also been extracting gold in exchange for weapons to fuel their own war against Ukraine. And so you have kind of all of these external actors being drawn into this war. I would still not describe it as a proxy war, though, because this is a war that is driven by domestic military elites who are trying to, protect their own political and financial interests. It's a counter-revolutionary war that is internationalized, right? They're doing this in partnership with elites in the Emirates, in Egypt, in Russia, who are benefiting tremendously from these expanding profit margins. And the people who are suffering the most are Sudanese civilians, right? In this kind of the largest humanitarian and hunger crisis in the world, in a country, as you mentioned, that could easily feed itself and the entire region and was once touted the breadbasket of the Middle East.
This war is often called the Forgotten War, but I wonder if that term is somewhat disingenuous, because people know what's going on in Sudan, and yet we don't see the kind of international humanitarian response to the crisis in Sudan like we see perhaps in a place like the Ukraine, where there's been an enormous response by countries like Canada, by countries across Europe, United States. It seems as if there isn't as much interest or concern about what's going on in Sudan. How do you explain the lack of engagement?
Yeah, I mean, it's been one of the most frustrating aspects of this There's a virtual, as you know, media blackout on what's happening in Sudan, despite the fact that it constitutes the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The international community has failed to fund the UN's response plan, right? The $4.6 billion that they estimate is needed to launch a robust aid response. I think only 23% of it has been funded. There have been no special visas for Sudanese refugees issued, right? In fact, Canada, I think, admitted about 300,000 Ukrainians when the war in Ukraine started. Less than 3,000 Sudanese have been admitted since the war in Sudan began, even though more people have been displaced by it.
Does the Canadian government explain, like, when members of Canada's Sudanese community have approached the Canadian government and asked why they are not letting more Sudanese in, people who are desperate for refuge, desperate for comfort and for safety, what does the Canadian government say?
Their response has been dismal and anti-Black. I just have to be frank about that. They don't care. I mean, I think as long as the non-Sudanese public, right, the vast majority of Canadians do not know about what's happening and are not out on the streets pushing their MPs to do something about it, the Canadian government doesn't see it in their interest to admit more Sudanese refugees. While at the same time, they invited a Sudanese delegation to the PDAC, the mining convention that happened, right? And so there's even a Canadian PR firm based in Montreal that had been advising the RSF after they committed the massacre in conjunction with the army in the sit-in after al-Bashir was ousted. That PR firm, headed by an ex-Israeli intelligence officer, by the way, has been supporting them to develop their PR strategy. And this is one of the reasons why you have some people talking about them as if they're going to be bringing democracy to Sudan when they're committing a genocide in Darfur, and had been, in 2003 as well. So it's really quite appalling, and I'm just disgusted by the Canadian response, to be honest. In some ways, I don't think that more coverage necessarily means better policy. We've seen that in relation to Gaza. There is better coverage, but the response has still been dismal. But I think that in the case of Sudan, if more people knew, I think there would be more mobilizing and there would be more pressure on the Canadian government to open up a special visa program for refugees. There is a family reunification program that began, when the war started, that is allowing Sudanese Canadians to reunite with their family members, that has not been implemented. People have been waiting for 2 years. And meanwhile, some of their relatives have died in this war because the Canadian government has taken so long to process things, and they're not responding to people's requests for follow-up. The policy is deadly, is what I would say. And I really hope that anyone listening to this will feel inspired to call their MPs, their local politicians, and really pressure them to do something about this. I think that's the least we can do, is to allow people to reunite with their family members and to open up a more robust refugee program that is on par with what was done for Ukrainians.
Nisrin, in recent weeks and months, we've seen that there are Sudanese refugees returning home, even displaced people trying to get back to their communities. What do you see as being a way for this conflict to end? Is there an initiative that international actors could be taking to enable folks to resume their lives in Sudan? What needs to happen to end this conflict?
I mean, that's a great question. I think, there have been kind of high-level negotiations recently in July that were U.S.-led that failed. And I think part of the reason these high-level negotiations fail is because the U.S., the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and I believe it's maybe the U.K. are the ones leading these processes. And they were doing so after the coup as well. They were trying to sort of bring Sudan back onto the path towards democratic elections. And instead what they did is they legitimized and propped up the war leaders. And so far, these high-level negotiations have only served to prolong the war, to kind of give them a slap on the wrist, but allow them to continue. So I think really what needs to happen is, at that level, we need to stop legitimizing these war criminals and center the people on the ground, like the emergency response rooms, like the resistance committees, the civilians who are really fighting for peace, right? Sustainable peace and survival. We need to center them in coming up with a solution for how to end this war. They have ideas about what that looks like. They've even put out statements about it. And so for me, as somebody sitting in a diaspora, I look to the people most impacted by the war to come up with ways out. Now, I think the main thing, though, is that we need to stop the funding and the ways that people are profiting off this war, and to really highlight the role of these external actors before we can get to a ceasefire. So I think that's why divestment and sort of pressure on the external actors, giving them bad PR, highlighting their role in the media, for example, can actually go a long way in also forcing them to make concessions and to create the conditions for a ceasefire to be a possibility.
Sudan is not just a place on the map for you. It's not just another state that is struggling. It's home for you. It is family. It is memories. What does Sudan kind of represent to you? What is Sudan to Nisrin Elamin?
For me, of course, it's where my heart is. I didn't grow up in Sudan in part because of the kind of instability and state violence and so forth. But my heart has always been there. And the people that I've left behind in this war that are still there are people who helped raise me. So I feel a great responsibility not only to them, but to the people of Sudan as a whole. And for me, the revolution, I think, is what really brought together the possibility of a new Sudan. There's somebody by the name of Dr. John Garang, who was one of the leaders of the Southern People's Liberation Movement. He had envisioned a new Sudan that everybody, regardless of who you are, what racial, ethnic background, what gender, age, class, would be treated as a first-class citizen, would have, access to similar opportunities or same opportunities. And I think that is a possibility. To me, actually, the revolution and even the mobilizing that is happening during this war is really dismantling the old Sudan that has always been violent, even though to some degree, because of my own privilege of where I'm from, I haven't been as impacted in the same way. But that old Sudan is crumbling, and there is something there that is hopeful for me, in that I think there's a possibility that we can build a new Sudan that is very different from the state that formed in 1956, that is not based on violence and racism and, elite kind of capture and extraction, but that celebrates the diversity of the country, that allows people to benefit from their own resources. And ultimately, also, if we think on a planetary scale, that also allows for people to live sustainable lives that protect the planet, right? We're all connected in that way. I think so many people were really taken by the power of the revolution and how it moved from protests to boycotts and sit-ins and some of the longest labor protests in Sudanese history, and people really mobilizing at all levels and all scales of society to take back power from elites. And that served, I think, as a model for other revolutions, like in Lebanon, even in Burkina Faso, like elsewhere, right? And so for the resistance committees to have emerged out of that, the 8,000 resistance committees that existed, right, and that continue to exist, is incredibly powerful. It's a model for the rest of the world, really, in what people power looks like. To me, I think that gives me a lot of hope.
Nisrin Elamin, it's very good of you to join us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me and also for covering what's happening in Sudan.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time.